Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Reed Burgett. I'm an assistant professor in geological sciences at NMSU. And I'd like to welcome you here to this talk in the NMSU Climate Change Education Seminar Series. We've been bringing speakers here to talk to the community about once a month over the last 2 years or so. This is the next to last talk for this academic year. Our final talk is going to be on April 22nd. That's Earth Day at 7 o'clock downtown at the Rio Grande Theater. And our speaker is going to be Leah Gerber, who's going to be speaking about global biodiversity conservation. So I'd encourage you to all come along for that one as well. One other thing, just a reminder to please silence your cell phones if they're on already. Thanks. Okay, so our speaker this evening is Brian McPherson. He's a brief bio for him. He got a BS in geophysics at the University of Oklahoma in 1989. And then he moved west and completed master's and PhD degrees, also in geophysics at the University of Utah, finishing his PhD in '96. And then he moved down our way and took a professorship at New Mexico Tech in 1997. And he actually lived here in Las Cruces, at least for parts of the week over the years from 2002 to 2005. So if he looks familiar, that could be why. And then he moved on and he moved back to Utah, where he took a position as the U-Star professor in civil engineering. And he also holds a position with the Energy and Geoscience Institute at the University of Utah. Brian's research really spans a broad range of fields. You can look him up if you're interested in any of this stuff, but he's published extensively, and I'd say, just to characterize his work, he's really interested, it seems like, in how things work in the subsurface of the Earth, how heat moves around, how fluids move around, how fluids interact with rocks and each other. So he's really worked on a lot of diverse things. And over the last couple of years, he's applied this curiosity to this problem of carbon sequestration, that he's going to talk about tonight. And as part of that, he's the science director of the Southwest Regional Partnership on Carbon Sequestration that's been funded by the Department of Energy over the last 20 years or so. So I think we'll hear quite a bit about that from Brian. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Brian to give his talk on the competing risks and benefits of geologic carbon dioxide sequestration. So please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Rich. Really appreciate it. I've been really blessed over the years in a lot of ways. I'm really, it's just seeing all of you here tonight, so really thank you. What we'll probably do is maybe tackle the lights in just a moment. Yes, my wife studied at New Mexico State from 2002 until 2005, so as Reed mentioned, we lived pretty close to campus, and I basically spent the middle part of the week in Socorro, and then the extended weekends here in Las Cruces. So pretty familiar. It was great to be home, and she was going to be here this week, but unfortunately had a little skiing accident and damaged her knee, so she's on crutches, so she'll be back in time. But I'm here to talk about carbon storage, and it's one of my favorite topics over the last 20 years now. I started working on this, actually 23, started working on it in 1997, 1998 timeframe. And we've got, what, 4 hours, right? So we covered it in great great detail.
Brian, could you speak into the mic a little bit?
Certainly, certainly. First, some acknowledgments. Want to acknowledge the Department of Energy. So most of the research that I'll talk about tonight, the technical results that you'll see, were supported by the National Energy Technology Laboratory, as well as the Energy and Geoscience Institute, and also a great group of students that's changed over the years. Actually, a couple of kids there that you see were there 10 years ago, and they're still there, but now actually in different capacities. But really terrific group of people working with me now. Multiple PhD students and postdocs, and I gotta say that this is the best group that I've had, just ever. They're just really terrific kids, and some of the work, all the work they've done is really fantastic, and I really do owe a lot of gratitude to them, and you'll see why in just a few moments. So I'm going to start off with the conclusions, and kind of like to start off with the punchline first, and then lay out the details of that and why. So the conclusions are the benefits and the risks of carbon storage. Now, I'll talk about in detail what is carbon storage, carbon sequestration, but and that's just as you might think, it's capturing carbon dioxide from a power plant or another source of CO2, compressing that carbon dioxide, injecting it into the subsurface in a nutshell. And some benefits of that include caveats included, mitigate global warming. So that's one of the chief benefits. Probably what I think is more significant and definitely more tangible is reducing ocean acidification. And it really does promote switching to cleaner fuels. So if there's a mandate to switch to pay either through incentive or through tax or otherwise to facilitate capturing CO2, which isn't done now. It's not very expensive to do it now because it's not done. But it will be expensive to carry it out later. So there's a motivation to switch to fuels that don't emit as much CO2. Or any for that matter, and then also encouraging energy independence. And finally, there's a ton, just a huge number of technological achievements that have been garnered because of the work. And kind of like, well, it's not like the moon program, but still there's some benefits. But the risks, some high costs. There's certainly potential for doubling of your electricity bill, for example, if carbon storage is mandated or required. Potential impacts, and we've studied this in detail. I'll show you an example. Impacts on drinking water. Possibility, for example, we focus explicitly on arsenic, and it's a definitive possibility. I'll talk about that in a bit. And probably even more significant than that is potential for reduced seismicity. So there's, all of these benefits, really, you've got to factor in the risks as well. And it's a complicated story. I'll try to lay it out for you. And then, of course, surface leakage, which personally, it's my opinion, leakage is even though EPA rules are focused a great deal on leakage, I don't think it's such a phenomenon, and I'll explain a giant risk, and I'll explain why during the course of the evening. And if I don't, please ask me about it. And legal conflicts, because those always happen. All right, so the greenhouse effect. Show this graphic first, but then want to move right into a greenhouse. So greenhouse is long-wave radiation, or rather short-wave radiation from the sun, penetrates a greenhouse, and it actually warms the floor of the greenhouse, if you will, and that is radiated as long-wave radiation. And glass captures that, releases some of it, but captures most of the heat and infrared radiation from the long wave, the reflected radiation from really the floor of the greenhouse. Same thing with the Earth. The concept is that shortwave sunlight enters the Earth's atmosphere, and then greenhouse gases, that being carbon dioxide, and more importantly, water vapor. Can't control water vapor. Water vapor is actually temperature control. You reduce the temperature, you actually condense water. So we can control non-condensable gases like carbon dioxide, much more critical because we are emitting that CO2. So even though water vapor is a more powerful greenhouse gas, CO2 is something that we really need to worry about a lot more. And as you reduce the temperature and you reduce that water vapor. And likewise methane. And those greenhouse gases trap that long wave radiation that's reflected from the Earth when the Earth's surface is heated. So that's the concept. Increase CO2, increase the greenhouse effect cause warming. And since the Industrial Revolution, we've seen this is departure from normal from the average over 1960. So this is actually when it's been calculated in pretty good detail, but then temperature proxies have been used for years prior. But effectively, the trend is over the time since the Industrial Revolution that CO2 concentration has increased, as has the departure from this base normal. Reed, you mentioned that the pointer would kind of, yeah. But in any case, CO2 concentration as of today is 414 parts per million. And as you can see from the trend, it was much less, even in the 60s and 70s, so down around 330 parts per million. So it's dramatically increased, well over 20% over the last couple of decades. And the correlation is with that increase in temperature. So the question becomes, though, is CO2 really causing, is the greenhouse effect caused by anthropogenic CO2? But you start to look at the emissions of CO2 throughout the region. The size of these red circles correlates to the size of the emissions point, the power plants. So anywhere from 1 to 3 million tons per year up to 14 to 15 million tons per year. And the blue areas are natural CO2 storage sites. So McKelmo Dome, Bravo Dome, Sheep Mountain, a lot of, in fact, McKelmo Dome has 11 gigatons, so 11 billion tons of CO2 naturally stored. So CO2 storage in the subsurface is already demonstrated to work. These big black lines are pipelines connecting those natural CO2 sources to oil fields in western Texas. So there's some desired use and usage of, to the tune of, the numbers aren't on here, but there's about 30 million tons of CO2 per year piped from those natural sources to oil fields in West Texas. So if you could even offset those with anthropogenic power plant source CO2, would be a great thing. This is one of those power plants. This is the Hunter Power Plant in central Utah, and it's become, Rocky Mountain Power has actually supported a great deal of our work in helping us examine capture of CO2 and some of the technical as well as non-technical hurdles for that. This is a typical CO2 injection site. I think this one is also southern Utah, but actually that might be Farmington, New Mexico as well. Deployed a test near Farmington. Okay, is the greenhouse effect why climate is warming? And I'm going to ask you to put on your skeptic hat for a moment. And no, I didn't break it out. I actually have that is a button. I was going to wear the button. It's actually in my book bag. 3 years ago, 2017, I attended a conference, and a gentleman was handing these buttons out, and he contended and said, you cannot prove that the greenhouse effect is happening on Earth. So you need to prove it with a real experiment. And if you will prove it, I will give you $10,000 cash. And he actually, and I think the offer still stands today. He will give $10,000 cash to anyone who can prove it. And it's, I think it's justproveco2.com if you're interested. But his question was, is the greenhouse gas effect really responsible for global warming? And this is an example that I assembled long before 2017, but it was one of the examples that I like to cite when it comes to explaining, understanding why there might be doubt about the greenhouse gas effect, and that is with sunspots. So sunspot activity, solar flares increase, they change, increase, decrease over time, and likewise the global temperature through proxies again, increase and decrease over time. And largely, there's some correlation between sunspots and sunspot activity and temperature. And then also you look at the CO2 that's plotted by the blue lines, the CO2 concentration, which largely tracks an average of those trends. So if you think about the oceans, your soda pop, if you've got a bottle of Coke and you warm it, it sits out in the sun, you open that bottle, it emits a lot of CO2, right? Because CO2 is less soluble in warm liquid than it is in warm water than it is in cold water. So CO2, cold water absorbs much more, dissolves much more CO2. So if you were to heat the Earth with excess solar radiation, sunspot activity, you would heat up the oceans, and then the oceans would release the CO2 because the water temperature is warmer. They can't dissolve as much CO2. So it's actually not an unreasonable explanation. But the problem with this explanation is that if the CO2 concentration of the ocean is decreasing, it's being released, then it should be getting, the ocean, then it should be getting more acidic, or less acidic rather, it's releasing CO2. But the problem is the data show that ocean acidification is definitely, has been happening, has been increasing. Okay, it's getting more acidic, pH is decreasing over time. So pre-industrial age 8.96, down to a pH of 8.05 now, and it's even more now. This is a paper from 2008. So I'm going to show you a lot of viewpoint from 2008 quite a bit, because then the data actually shift quite a bit after 2008. But this graphic was shown by former Vice President Al Gore in his documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, I think it was Dr. Levitt. And, but back then the CO2 concentration that he showed in the documentary, I think, was well below 400. Now it's 414. And then after 50 years, it would be at least 600. Now, it's an interesting story though, since data started changing in 2009, thereabouts. So before we embark on the data, though, I wanted to talk about just a quick anecdote. When I was faculty at New Mexico Tech, the state engineer in New Mexico came through, gave a presentation, and he cited 3,400 lawsuits against his office over water rights, and all at once. And I was like, wow, what a strange, it wasn't nearly as wacky as Utah, though. I mean, Utah has passed resolution after they pass multiple resolutions every year, the legislature does, and this one in particular, coinciding with former President Obama's new policy on the CCS task force, which this was again in 2008, and they wanted to have 10 commercial storage projects in line active by 2016. It's 2020. And actually we do. If you consider oil recovery projects, we do have 10 commercial projects. But at the same time, the legislature of Utah passed a resolution supporting carbon capture and sequestration technology. But in 2000, so that's along with hydrogen from coal. In 2010, they passed a resolution condemning the EPA's activities and specifically calling for cessation of all policies and regulations until the global warming science is substantiated, which I thought was kind of an interesting choice of wording. But then in 2018, the resolution encourages responsible stewardship of natural resources and prioritize our understanding and use of sound science to address causes of a changing climate. So finally, 8 years after that, they started to acknowledge what was already stated by the IPCC. Then in 2020, I had a 2019 in there. I must have eliminated the 2019, but in 2020, they specifically cite reducing emissions and supporting competition for a future Olympic bid. So they've got the regulations. Okay, what do some of the other stakeholders, in fact, big oil? So I probably get a question every couple of weeks about oil companies and their role in carbon. And, well, Exxon had a stakeholder meeting in 2018 in which the shareholders, the majority of shareholders, called on the company to reduce its greenhouse gases, which was pretty, I'm going to abuse the word, you heard it if you watched any of the Super Tuesday coverage yesterday, unprecedented. It was really abused last night. Last night was kind of unprecedented, but in any case, to have one of the most major oil companies, their shareholders, call for reduced greenhouse gas emissions, pretty significant. But then a year later, the company was sued for deceiving investors. This was just a year later after the shareholder meeting. So pretty interesting, and that's still ongoing, so it's not been resolved. Meanwhile, Chevron, just this year, just a couple of weeks ago, literally invested a huge stake in a carbon capture company. So I'm going to talk a little bit about carbon capture, a lot about carbon storage today. Chevron already sees it. Chevron has already proposed to become completely carbon neutral by 2050. That's also pretty unprecedented for an oil company whose assets are completely based on carbon. To become carbon neutral is pretty significant. And then lastly, this was actually a couple of, a year and a half ago when this was announced, Occidental Oil, they call it Oxy Low Carbon Adventure, well, it's a subsidiary of Occidental Oil Company, carbon engineering, out of Canada, combined, they're building a direct air capture plant in the Permian Basin. This is huge. They've actually announced 500 kilotons of storage, and now they've increased that to 1 million tons of storage, basically. So 500,000 to 1 million tons of storage, or capture and storage every year. So that's pretty significant. And usually when the big companies like this start something, the smaller companies follow suit. So this is actually pretty good news. So what is carbon capture and sequestration? So the idea, as I explained it at the beginning, and this is a graphic that one of an undergraduate student put this together for me. I'd like to say I put this together, but an undergraduate put this together. It's a pretty nice little animation that he assembled. And his name is Aaron Meyer. He's now actually a master's student, but in any case, the idea is to capture the CO2 from a power plant, and then pipe that CO2 to injection wells into oil reservoirs, gas reservoirs, unminable coal seams, as well as deep, unusable saline aquifers. And oil companies prefer to call them oil saline reservoirs, but they are aquifers, they're just saline aquifers. And over time, and CO2